Welcome to NibblePop Stories. Today we will hear the story of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. Jane Eyre, a 10-year-old orphan, lives with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, at Gateshead Hall. After her parents died of typhus, Jane's uncle, Mr. Reed, took her in but passed away shortly after. Mrs. Reed treats her with neglect and cruelty. Jane's cousins, Georgiana and Eliza, showed no affection toward her, while their brother John is openly hostile, often reminding Jane of her dependence on the family. The story begins on a cold, dreary November afternoon at Gateshead Hall. Jane is excluded from the company of her aunt and cousins. While they enjoy the warmth of the drawing room, Jane finds solace in a window seat, reading Bewick's History of British Birds. The bullying John interrupts Jane's reading. He says she has no right to read their books because she is an orphan who is dependent on his family. He strikes her with the book. Jane is usually submissive, but today she defends herself for the first time. She lashes out at John, calling him a murderer and a slave driver. They fight, but Jane's outburst shocks John, and he retreats in fear. Mrs. Reed sides with her son and punishes Jane for her behavior, locking her in the dreaded Red Room, a cold, eerie chamber where her Uncle Reed died. Mrs. Reed's maids, Bessie and Miss Abbott, force Jane into the Red Room. The Red Room gets its name from the red curtains and furniture. It also contains a miniature portrait of Mr. Reed, who has been dead for 9 years. Most of the household avoids this room. Jane catches sight of her reflection in a mirror and is startled by her pale, ghostly appearance. She recalls that after her parents died, Mr. Reed took her in and made his wife promise to raise Jane as her own child. Suddenly, a ray of light enters the room and Jane becomes convinced that her Uncle Reed's ghost is present. She imagines he has come to take revenge on Mrs. Reed for breaking her promise. She cries out. The servants open the door, but Mrs. Reed refuses to release her. Locked back in the Red Room, Jane faints in exhaustion and fear. When Jane wakes up, she finds herself in her own bedroom, in the care of Mr. Lloyd, the family's apothecary. Mr. Lloyd gives instructions for Jane's care before leaving, and Bessie attends to Jane during the night. Bessie tries to soothe her with a fruit tart and her favorite book, Gulliver's Travels, but Jane remains deeply affected by the traumatic experiences in the Red Room. Even Bessie's singing brings her to tears as it reminds her of her loneliness as an orphan. The next day, when Mr. Lloyd returns to examine her, Jane confides in him about her misery. Mr. Lloyd asks if she would like to attend school, and Jane eagerly agrees. She sees school as a welcome escape from her oppressive life. Mrs. Reed also supports the idea, viewing it as an opportunity to get rid of Jane. Later, Jane overhears Bessie and Miss Abbott speaking. She learns that her mother was a member of the wealthy Reed family but was disowned for marrying a poor clergyman. As weeks turn into months, Jane endures cruelty while waiting for news about her schooling during the holidays when she is excluded from family celebrations. However, she begins to display a new defiance. On one occasion, she boldly questions Mrs. Reed about how her late uncle would judge her harsh treatment. Mrs. Reed is furious and punishes her, but Jane notices a flicker of fear in her aunt's expression. One day, Jane is summoned to the breakfast room to meet Mr. Brocklehurst, the strict headmaster of Lowood School. Mr. Brocklehurst questions Jane about her religious beliefs. When Jane admits that she finds the Psalms uninteresting, he warns her that such attitudes reflect a wicked heart that must be cleansed through repentance. Mrs. Reed tells Mr. Brocklehurst that she hopes Jane's time at Lowood will reform her, particularly her tendency to lie. This accusation hurts Jane deeply as she values her honesty above all else. After Mr. Brocklehurst departs, Jane confronts her aunt, accusing her of being cruel and unjust. As her departure for Lowood draws closer, Jane begins to cherish Bessie's rare moments of kindness. Bessie tells her stories, sings to her, and even admits that she prefers Jane to the Reed children. 4 days later, on a January morning, Jane leaves Gateshead. Upon arriving at Lowood, she is guided to a dormitory filled with rows of narrow beds, each shared by two girls. The following morning, Jane is introduced to Lowood's rigid routine. The girls rise before dawn and begin their day with Bible recitations and hours of lessons, sustained by tasteless, insufficient meals. Jane finds some comfort in the occasional moments of compassion shown by Miss Temple, the school's kind and fair superintendent. Jane soon forms a bond with Helen Burns, a slightly older girl who explains that Lowood is a charity school for orphan girls with tuition funded by benefactors. In the afternoon, a history teacher named Miss Scatcherd punishes Helen, forcing her to stand in the middle of the classroom as punishment for minor mistakes. Jane wonders how Helen endures the humiliation with such calm and grace. On her second day, Jane learns that life at Lowood School is difficult. The dormitory is so cold that the water in the wash basins are frozen solid. Breakfast is inadequate and the lessons are strict, allowing no room for error. During a sewing lesson, Jane's attention is drawn to Helen Burns. In spite of Helen's remarkable intellect and her ability to answer Miss Scatcherd's questions correctly, she is frequently punished for minor faults, such as her posture or the cleanliness of her nails. Jane wonders why Helen doesn't defend herself. Instead, Helen silently obeys, fetching a bundle of sticks that Miss Scatcherd uses to strike her. Jane is horrified by the injustice and amazed by Helen's passive acceptance of the punishment. Helen explains her philosophy is rooted in Christian teachings, which advocates loving one's enemies and turning the other cheek. She believes in enduring hardship with patience, trusting in the promise of a better afterlife. Jane strongly disagrees. She argues that injustice should be met with resistance, not submission. She recounts her own experiences of mistreatment at Gateshead, but Helen insists that life is too short for hatred or resentment. Their contrasting perspectives on justice and endurance deepen their bond. Winter at Lowood is more difficult. The bitter cold, insufficient clothing, and miajo food leave the girls hungry and shivering. Older girls often steal Jane's food. The daily hours spent outside in freezing temperatures causes Jane's feet to become swollen and inflamed. When Mr. Brocklehurst arrives, he quickly confirms his authority. He scolds Miss Temple for showing compassion towards the students. He insists that their suffering is necessary to teach humility and endurance. Noticing a girl with curly red hair, he orders that all the girl's hair be cut off. During his visit, Jane accidentally drops her slate. Mr. Brocklehurst forces her to stand on a stool in front of the entire school. He declares her a liar and forbids the other students from speaking to her for the rest of the day. Jane's only comfort is the small, reassuring smiles Helen offers as she walks past. When school is dismissed, Jane falls to the floor, filled with shame, fearing that all the students will despise her because of Mr. Brocklehurst's false accusations. Miss Temple invites her to her room. Over tea and cake, Miss Temple encourages Jane to share her side of the story. Jane recounts her experiences at Gateshead and the cruelty she endured. Miss Temple decides to confirm Jane's account with Mr. Lloyd, who visited her during her illness. The following week, Mr. Lloyd's letter arrives, verifying Jane's story. Miss Temple publicly clears Jane's name in front of the entire school, announcing that Mr. Brocklehurst's accusations were baseless. Jane feels a renewed sense of belonging as the burden of shame is lifted. Jane excels particularly in drawing and French. Though Lowood remains a place of hardship, it begins to offer Jane a sense of purpose and the companionship she missed at Gateshead. As spring arrives, typhus spreads with alarming intensity. More than half the students fall ill. Many are sent home, while others succumb to the disease. Jane, miraculously untouched by the epidemic, enjoys the lush greenery and the companionship of her new friend, Mary Ann Wilson. Helen Burns becomes gravely ill with consumption and is kept isolated from the rest of the school. When Jane overhears that Helen is nearing the end, she determines to see her friend one last time. Late one night, she finds Helen lying in bed. Helen's breathing is shallow, but her face is serene. Jane's heart aches, yet Helen meets her with a calm smile. She speaks of death not as an end, but as a return to God, a release from the trials of the world. Helen urges Jane not to mourn. Jane climbs into bed and holds her close. The warmth of their friendship surrounds them like a final embrace, and they fall asleep together. When morning comes, Jane awakens to silence. Helen's hand is cold in hers. Her spirit has departed in the night. Helen is buried in the nearby churchyard. Jane never forgets her friend. 15 years later, she ensures a marble tablet is placed over the grave bearing the word Resurgam, Latin for I will rise again. The typhus epidemic at Lowood exposes the school's terrible conditions and Mr. Brocklehurst's negligence. In response, the school's benefactors remove him from his position of unchecked authority. A new committee takes control of Lowood, improving living conditions and ensuring proper care. With healthier meals and warmer clothing, the students can finally focus on their education. Over the next 6 years, Jane excels in her studies. After graduating, she stays on as a teacher for 2 more years. However, when Miss Temple marries and leaves, Jane feels a void in her life and yearns for change. She places an advertisement in a local newspaper offering her services as a governess. A week later, she receives a reply from Mrs. Fairfax, who offers her a position at Thornfield Manor to tutor a young girl. Jane eagerly accepts the offer and begins preparing for her journey. Before leaving Lowood, Jane receives an unexpected visit from Bessie, now married to the coachman Robert Leven. Bessie reveals that John Reed has become a gambler and an alcoholic. Georgiana attempted to elope with Lord Edwin Vere, but her plan was ruined when Eliza informed Mrs. Reed. The Reed family is now in chaos. Bessie also shares surprising news about Jane's uncle, Mr. John Eyre, a successful wine merchant. 7 years earlier, shortly after Jane left Gateshead, he visited in search of her. Bessie praises Jane for how far she has come compared to the Reeds. Jane's journey to Thornfield is challenging. Her driver arrives late at the Millcote station, and by the time she reaches the manor, it is already dark. Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, greets her warmly. She explains that the manor belongs to Mr. Rochester, who travels often and leaves her in charge. Jane's job is to tutor Adele Warrens, Mr. Rochester's 8-year-old ward. Adele's mother was a French performer, and the child speaks a mix of French and English. Mrs. Fairfax shows Jane to her room. The next morning, Jane meets Adele, a lively and talkative girl. Later, Mrs. Fairfax gives Jane a tour of the house. Thornfield's interior is elegant, with the third floor packed with old furniture and relics from the past. As they walk through the house, Jane hears a strange, echoing laugh coming from upstairs. She feels curious. She asks Mrs. Fairfax about it. Mrs. Fairfax says the noise is from Grace Poole, a servant and dressmaker who works at Thornfield. Jane settles into life at Thornfield. She enjoys teaching Adele and feels a sense of accomplishment in her work. The third floor holds an air of mystery, with strange laughter and odd murmurs occasionally echoing through its halls. Jane often notices Grace Poole, a plain and reserved servant, quietly going about her duties. One January day, Jane volunteers to deliver a letter to town for Mrs. Fairfax. As she walks, a large dog appears, followed by a rider on horseback. Suddenly, the horse slips on a patch of ice, and its rider tumbles to the ground. Jane rushes to help the man and assists him in remounting his horse. She later learns that the gentleman is Mr. Rochester, the master of Thornfield, who has just returned home. Mr. Rochester's arrival brings new energy to Thornfield. He invites Jane and Adele to join him for tea alongside Mrs. Fairfax. While Mr. Rochester interrogates Jane about her background, his interest grows when he examines her watercolor sketches. Jane finds Mr. Rochester's behavior erratic, marked by mood swings. Mrs. Fairfax describes him as a man shaped by a troubled family history. His father and elder brother conspired to exclude him from their inheritance, an experience that left lasting scars on Mr. Rochester. During the days following his return, Mr. Rochester remains busy with business and social obligations. Jane sees little of him. One evening, however, he summons Jane and Adele to his drawing room. He gives Adele a toy and starts a candid conversation with Jane. He boldly asks if she finds him handsome. Jane is caught off guard. She replies honestly, "No, sir." Mr. Rochester is amused rather than offended, and his reaction makes Jane suspect he has been drinking. Their conversation turns personal. Mr. Rochester insists their relationship should not be defined by employer and employee roles. They discuss philosophical topics, including sin, forgiveness, and redemption. Mr. Rochester hints at a past filled with mistakes and moral failings and expresses a desire for renewal and reform. When Adele returns to the room, dancing for attention, Mr. Rochester remarks that she reminds him of her mother, Celine Varens. He promises to tell Jane the full story another time. One afternoon, Mr. Rochester shares his story with Jane. He was once in love with Adele's mother, Celine Varens, a French opera dancer. Although Celine seemed devoted to him, Mr. Rochester found her with another man. He ended the relationship immediately and even wounded the man in a duel. He doubted that Adele was his daughter. However, when Celine abandoned Adele to run off with an Italian musician, he brought her to Thornfield. Jane feels sympathy for Adele and admiration for Mr. Rochester. She grows increasingly fond of him, but worries about his inevitable departure from Thornfield. One night, Jane hears strange noises outside her door, a scraping sound followed by a demonic laugh. She stepped into the hallway and notices smoke coming from Mr. Rochester's room. Rushing inside, she finds his bed curtains ablaze and him asleep amid the smoke. Jane quickly puts out the flames with water. Mr. Rochester discovers that the culprit was Grace Poole. He insists that Jane keep the incident a secret and thanks her for saving his life. He seems reluctant to let her leave for the night. Jane feels a deeper emotional connection to her employer. The next morning, Mr. Rochester explains to everyone that he accidentally fell asleep while reading by candlelight, which started the fire. Jane is astonished to see Grace Poole, calm and composed, repairing the burned bed curtains. When Jane questions Grace, she shows no sign of guilt. When Jane mentions the laughter, Grace suggests that Jane imagined it, but advises her to keep her bedroom door locked at night. Jane is confused by Grace's lack of remorse and wonders why Mr. Rochester insists on keeping the incident a secret. She also questions why an attempted murderer is allowed to stay at Thornfield. Mr. Rochester leaves Thornfield to attend a party at a nearby estate, the Lees. The household feels empty in his absence. Jane learns that the beautiful Blanche Ingram will also be at the party. It makes her jealous. She scolds herself for entertaining romantic hopes. How could a plain, poor governess like her even compare to someone like Miss Ingram? To remind herself of her position, Jane sketches two portraits. One is an unflattering self-portrait highlighting her plainness, and the other is a romanticized drawing of Blanche Ingram as she imagines her, beautiful, graceful, and refined. Jane decides to use these portraits to stop herself from hoping that Mr. Rochester might care for her. During Rochester's absence, Jane observes Grace Poole, who spends most of her time on the third floor. Jane overhears servants gossiping about Grace's unusually high pay and challenging job, which deepens her suspicions about Grace's true role at Thornfield. Mr. Rochester returns with a group of guests, including the beautiful Blanche Ingram. He summons Jane and Adele to join the party. Jane notices Blanche's charm and beauty, as well as Mr. Rochester's apparent preference for her company. Jane feels increasingly out of place. Blanche and her mother, Mrs. Ingram, treat Jane dismissively. Blanche flirts with Mr. Rochester and plays the piano, prompting him to sing with her. Watching them together, Jane becomes painfully aware of the impossibility of her dreams. She quietly slips away. In the hallway, Mr. Rochester stops her. He allows her to leave, but insists she must attend the evening gatherings every night while the guests are at Thornfield. The guests stay at Thornfield for several days. Each evening, Jane watches Rochester and Blanche closely. During a game of charades, they act out a marriage ceremony. Jane becomes convinced they will marry. Blanche appears to seek Mr. Rochester's wealth, while he seems drawn to her social status and beauty. Jane views Blanche as shallow and insincere, and she hopes Mr. Rochester will see through her manipulations. One day, while Mr. Rochester is away, a stranger arrives at Thornfield. He introduces himself as Richard Mason, an acquaintance of Mr. Rochester from the West Indies. Jane learns that Mr. Rochester once lived there. Later that evening, an old gypsy woman comes to Thornfield, offering to read the fortunes of the ladies. Blanche is the first to meet her in the library. When she returns, she looks upset. The other young women are more amused by their fortunes. Finally, the gypsy insists on reading Jane's fortune. The woman begins describing Jane's feelings and situation with uncanny accuracy. She says that Jane can be happy if she will only reach out for it. The gypsy then reveals that she upset Blanche Ingram by suggesting that Mr. Rochester is not as wealthy as he seems. When the gypsy asks about Jane's feelings for Mr. Rochester, Jane denies having any romantic interest. As the gypsy continues speaking, her voice gradually deepens and her gestures become familiar. Jane suddenly realizes the truth. The gypsy is none other than Mr. Rochester in disguise. Jane reproaches Rochester for tricking her. Rochester grows serious when Jane informs him that Mr. Mason has arrived at Thornfield. He asks Jane if she would stand by him during a scandal. Jane assures him that she would. Rochester then asks Jane to discreetly invite Mason to meet him. Jane does as instructed and retires to her room for the night. A piercing scream wakes everyone in the house during the night. The guests gather in the hallway, but Mr. Rochester says it was just a servant having a nightmare. Later, Rochester knocks on Jane's door and asks for her help. He leads her to the third floor, where she finds Mr. Mason bleeding heavily from stab and bite wounds. Rochester instructs Jane to tend to Mason, but forbids them from speaking to each other. He then leaves to fetch a surgeon. Jane is frightened by the groans and snarls coming from a nearby locked room. 2 hours later, Rochester returns with the surgeon who treats Mason's injuries. Once Mason is stable, they quietly send him away in a carriage. Afterward, Rochester takes Jane for a walk in the garden. He tells her a story about a young man who committed a serious mistake in a distant country and tried to forget it. Over time, the man found hope for redemption in a good and moral person. Rochester asks Jane if the man would be justified in ignoring society to be with this person. Jane replies that true redemption can only come from God, not another person. Rochester then asks whether Jane thinks marrying Blanche Ingram would bring him salvation. Jane remains silent and Rochester hurries away before she has a chance to answer. Jane receives shocking news that her cousin John Reed has committed suicide due to heavy debts, and her aunt, Mrs. Reed, has suffered a stroke from the shock and is close to death. Mrs. Reed has been asking to see Jane. Mr. Rochester grants Jane permission to leave Thornfield for a week. At Gateshead, Jane is warmly welcomed by Bessie, but her cousins Eliza and Georgiana remain cold and unkind. Eliza is stern, disciplined, and planning to enter a convent. Georgiana is still shallow and preoccupied with stories of her former high society life. The sisters hate each other as well. When Jane visits her aunt, Mrs. Reed remains bitter. One day, she calls Jane to her room and gives her a letter from her uncle, John Eyre, written 3 years earlier. In the letter, he expresses his desire to adopt Jane and leave her his fortune. Out of spite, Mrs. Reed withheld the letter and told John Eyre that Jane had died of typhus at Lowood. That night, Mrs. Reed dies. During her time at Gateshead, Jane sketches and draws portraits of her cousins. She fosters a brief connection with Georgiana. Her efforts to make peace with her past leave her feeling at ease. Jane remains at Gateshead for a month after Mrs. Reed's death to assist Georgiana and Eliza. Eventually, Georgiana moves to London and marries a wealthy man, while Eliza enters a convent in France. During her stay, Jane receives a letter from Mrs. Fairfax. She informs Jane that Mr. Rochester has travelled to London to purchase a new carriage, likely in preparation for his marriage to Blanche. This news troubles Jane, as she fears her time at Thornfield may soon come to an end. When Jane returns to Thornfield, she unexpectedly meets Mr. Rochester on the road. He asks her to look at his new carriage and tell him if it will suit his future wife. Despite her worries, Jane is overjoyed to see him again. In the following days, she notices no signs of wedding preparations, which gives her a glimmer of hope that Mr. Rochester's marriage to Blanche may not happen after all. One day Rochester talks to Jane under a chestnut tree about his plans to marry Miss Ingram. He tells her that he has arranged a governess position for her in Ireland. Jane hides her pain and tries to respond calmly. As they talk, Mr. Rochester admits he feels a deep connection to Jane. He says that if they were separated, it would cause him unbearable pain. Jane declares she cannot stay at Thornfield while he marries someone else. She rebukes him for choosing a loveless marriage. Rochester then reveals that he has no intention of marrying Miss Ingram. He explains that he only pretended to pursue Blanche to make Jane jealous. He also admits he spread a rumor about losing his fortune to test Blanche, and when she lost interest, it confirmed her superficiality. Jane agrees to marry Mr. Rochester. As they rush back to Thornfield in the pouring rain, Rochester kisses her. That night, during a storm, a bolt of lightning strikes the chestnut tree where Rochester proposed, splitting it in two. Mrs. Fairfax remains disapproving and warns Jane to be cautious about relationships between people of unequal status. Meanwhile, Rochester showers attention and gifts on Jane, but she feels uncomfortable with such extravagance. She refuses the jewels and declares that she will remain Adele's governess and live simply. She insists on maintaining her independence rather than being dressed like a doll. She writes to her uncle John Eyre, hoping that if he makes her his heir, she will feel less unequal to Rochester in terms of class and fortune. During the weeks leading up to the wedding, Jane keeps her distance from Rochester. She cannot shake the feeling that her happiness is too good to last. On the evening before the wedding, Jane's wedding dress and an expensive veil, a gift from Mr. Rochester, arrived. That night Jane had strange dreams. In one, she carried a crying child while walking down a long, winding path in search of Mr. Rochester. In another, she carried the child to the ruins of Thornfield Hall, but she lost her balance and dropped the child. The second dream startled Jane awake, and she saw a strange woman in her room. The woman, with wild hair and a pale face, rummaged through Jane's closet, found the wedding veil, and tore it in half. Then she looked at Jane with ghastly expression. Jane fainted in fear. When Jane tells Mr. Rochester, he says the woman must have been Grace Poole and promises to explain everything about her after they have been married. That night, Jane sleeps in Adele's nursery. She holds Adele close and cries, knowing she will soon leave the child when she becomes Mr. Rochester's wife. On the wedding day, Jane wears a plain veil she made herself to replace the one torn by the strange woman. She and Rochester head to the nearby church. As they enter, Jane notices two strangers seated inside. When the ceremony begins, one of the strangers speaks up. He introduces himself as Mr. Briggs, a solicitor from London, and declares that the marriage cannot proceed because Mr. Rochester already has a living wife. Briggs introduces the second stranger, Richard Mason, who confirms that Rochester is married to his sister, Bertha Mason. He explains that Bertha has been living at Thornfield for years and that he saw her during his recent visit. Mr. Rochester admits the truth. He explains that Bertha is insane and has been confined to the attic under Grace Poole's care. He invites everyone to Thornfield to see Bertha for themselves. The group ascends to the third-floor attic, where Grace Poole watches over Bertha. Jane is horrified by what she sees. Bertha paces the room like an animal, growling and attempting to strangle Rochester before he restrains her and ties her to a chair. He explains that her insanity was hidden from him before their marriage and that he has done his best to care for her sins. Back downstairs, Mr. Briggs informs Jane that her uncle, John Eyre, is gravely ill. It was through Jane's letter to her uncle that Briggs and Mason learned of the planned wedding and intervened. John Eyre, too weak to travel, had sent Mason to protect her. Jane is devastated. She locks herself in her room and prays silently, seeking strength and guidance from God. She knows she must leave Thornfield, yet she is torn by her love for Rochester. When she steps out of her room, she finds him waiting for her. He apologizes and begs for her forgiveness. Mr. Rochester suggests they leave England and live together in the south of France as man and wife. Jane refuses, staying true to her morals. She explains that as long as Bertha Mason is alive, she would only be his mistress. Mr. Rochester then tells her the story of his marriage. Rochester's father left the family estate to his older brother, Roland. To secure Rochester's future, his father arranged a wealthy marriage for him. He sent Rochester to Jamaica to meet Bertha Mason, who was set to inherit a large fortune. Captivated by her beauty and unaware of her family's history of mental illness, he agreed to marry her. After their marriage, he discovered Bertha's mother was in an asylum and her brother was mute. Over time, Bertha's behavior became wild, violent, and destructive. She eventually descended into madness. After his father and brother died, Rochester inherited their fortune. He brought Bertha to Thornfield and confined her to the attic under Grace Poole's care. He left England and travelled the world looking for love. His relationships with mistresses left him disillusioned and ashamed. When he met Jane, he knew she was the one he had been searching for. Jane cannot compromise her principles even for Rochester. She tells him that staying would mean losing her integrity and self-respect. That night, Jane has a vivid dream. Her mother urges her to escape temptation. Jane quietly packs her belongings and leaves Thornfield before dawn. Jane spends all her money on a coach ride. She accidentally leaves her belongings in the coach. Stranded at a crossroads, she is alone and hungry. That night, she sleeps outdoors under the stars. The next day, she walks into a village to look for work but finds none. She feels desperate. She tries to trade her gloves and handkerchief for bread, but the shopkeeper refuses. She begs at a farmhouse and gets only a slice of bread. As night falls, Jane sees a light in the distance. She follows it and finds a house on the moors. Through the window, she sees two young women, Mary and Diana Rivers, studying German, while their servant Hannah knits by the fire. Jane listens to their conversation and learns they are waiting for their brother, St. John. Jane knocks on the door and begs Hannah for shelter, but Hannah refuses. Jane feels weak and desperate. She collapses on the doorstep. At that moment, St. John arrives home. Hearing Jane's plea, he brings her into the house. Mary and Diana give her food and warmth. Too tired to explain her story, Jane tells them her name is Jane Eyre. Jane spends 3 days in bed recovering at the Rivers house. On the 4th day, she smells bread baking and goes to the kitchen. There she finds Hannah and learns more about the Rivers family. Hannah tells Jane that the house is called Moor House or Marsh End. It has been in the Rivers family for generations. Their father lost most of their fortune in a bad business deal. This forced Diana and Mary to work as governesses. They have returned to Moor House because their father recently passed away. Later, Jane meets Diana, Mary, and their brother St. John. They ask about her past, but Jane only admits that Jane Elliot is not her real name. She explains that she has no home or family, but is educated and willing to work. St. John promises to help her find a job. Diana and Mary tell Jane she can stay with them as long as she needs. Jane becomes close to Diana and Mary. She enjoys talking with them, sharing their love for nature and learning together. Diana teaches Jane German, while Jane helps Mary with drawing. St. John, however, stays distant and serious. He spends most of his time working in his parish. Jane finds him hard to talk to and senses that he is searching for something. One day, she hears him preach. His powerful sermon moves Jane deeply but also makes her feel sad. She thinks that, like her, St. John has not found true peace. After a month, Diana and Mary prepare to leave Moor House to return to their governess jobs. Jane asks St. John if he has found her work. She tells her about a school for girls he is opening in the nearby village of Morton. He offers Jane the job of headmistress. The pay is small, but Jane is happy to accept. Before Diana and Mary leave, the Rivers family receives sad news. Their wealthy uncle John has died. They had hoped to inherit money from him, but he left most of his fortune to an unknown relative. Diana explains that this uncle had caused the bad business deal that ruined their family's wealth. Jane moves into a small cottage at Morton and starts a job as headmistress of the new school. Her students are poor and have little education, but some are eager to learn. The work is difficult, but Jane is determined to help them improve. One day, St. John visits Jane to bring her a package from his sisters. During their talk, he tells Jane that he was unhappy as a parish priest a year ago. He thought about choosing a more exciting job, but felt a calling from God to become a missionary. Their conversation is interrupted by Miss Rosamond Oliver, a beautiful and elegant young woman. Jane realizes that Rosamond is the wealthy patron of the school. Rosamond talks happily with St. John. Watching them, Jane concludes they are in love, but St. John seems to hide his feelings. Jane starts to enjoy teaching and grows close to some of her older students. She often visits their homes and becomes well liked in the village. One day, while drawing a portrait of Rosamond, St. John visits Jane. She tells him that Rosamond has feelings for him. St. John admits he loves Rosamond but says he cannot marry her. She would not fit the life of a missionary's wife, and his duty to God is more important than his feelings. Later, Jane visits Mr. Oliver, Rosamond's father, at his home. She realizes Mr. Oliver respects St. John and would not oppose Rosamond marrying him. Jane suggests to St. John that he marry Rosamond and give up his missionary plans. St. John firmly refuses, saying he cannot let worldly desires interfere with his calling. Suddenly, St. John notices a small piece of paper on Jane's desk. He tears it up, pockets it, and quickly leaves the room, leaving Jane puzzled. One evening, St. John visits Jane at her cottage. He tells her that a solicitor, Mr. Briggs, is looking for a woman named Jane Eyre. Jane feels shocked and confused. She asks if Mr. Rochester is involved. St. John says no. Mr. Rochester has nothing to do with it. The search is because her uncle, John Eyre, has died and left her £20,000. Surprised, Jane finally admits she is Jane Eyre. St. John says he already suspected this. He had seen her name on a scrap of paper she signed while drawing. He then reveals his full name, St. John Eyre Rivers. His mother was an heir, which makes him, Diana and Mary, Jane's cousins. Jane is overjoyed to find she has a family. She decides to share the inheritance equally among the four of them. Her cousins protest, but Jane insists. Each of them receives £5,000. For the first time, Jane feels surrounded by love and family. Jane closes the school for Christmas and gets Moor House ready for Diana and Mary's arrival. When her cousins arrive, they enjoy a joyful and warm holiday together. One day, St. John tells Jane that Miss Oliver has married a wealthy man. He says he is glad because it allows him to focus on his plans to become a missionary. However, Jane notices that St. John seems colder and more distant as time passes. St. John asks Jane to study Hindustani with him, explaining that it will be useful for his mission work in India. During a walk one day, he surprises Jane by proposing marriage. He tells her she has the right qualities to be a missionary's wife and asks her to join him in his work in India. Jane is shocked and says she cannot marry him because they do not love each other. She offers to go to India as his sister instead. St. John rejects this, insisting that marriage is necessary. After this, St. John becomes even colder towards Jane. This makes Jane feel sad and uneasy. While she treasures her bond with Diana and Mary, St. John's increasing control over her life troubles her deeply. St. John keeps pressuring Jane to marry him and go to India. He tells her she cannot join him as an unmarried assistant and calls her refusal selfish. Diana supports Jane's decision. She warns that St. John only sees Jane as a tool for his mission. Diana believes Jane would lose her happiness and identity in such a marriage. Jane thinks about the hard life she would face in India. She realizes she cannot do it without love. She knows St. John's proposal is based on duty, not affection. One evening, St. John reads aloud from the Bible. His words are so powerful that for a moment, Jane even considers agreeing to marry him. But suddenly, she hears a mystical voice calling her name, Jane, Jane, Jane. She knows it is Mr. Rochester's voice. The sound fills her with clarity and breaks St. John's influence over her. Jane returns to her room and prays. She decides to find Mr. Rochester and follow her heart. St. John's hold on her is gone. For the first time, Jane feels free. The next morning, Jane wonders if she really heard Mr. Rochester's voice or if it was just her imagination. She finds a note from St. John asking for a final answer about his proposal. That afternoon, Jane decides to leave for Thornfield. After 2 days of traveling by coach, Jane reaches Thornfield. She is shocked to see that the manor is in ruins, destroyed by a fire. At a nearby inn, Jane learns what happened. One night, Bertha Mason escaped from Grace Poole's watch. She set fire to the room where the governess used to stay. Mr. Rochester saved all the servants and tried to rescue Bertha. However, she jumped from the roof and died. During the fire, Mr. Rochester was badly injured. He lost his eyesight and one of his hands. Now he lives at Ferndean, a quiet manor house nearby, with two elderly servants, John and Mary. Jane travels to Ferndean and sees Mr. Rochester from a distance. His body looks strong, but his face shows sadness and despair. She walks to the house and knocks on the door. Mary, one of the servants, answers, and Jane asks to see Mr. Rochester. When Mr. Rochester refuses to meet an unknown guest, Jane takes the tray Mary prepared and brings it to him. As she enters, Mr. Rochester hears her voice. At first, he thinks she is a ghost, but when he touches her hand, he realizes it is truly Jane. Overcome with emotion, he holds her tightly. Jane promises she will never leave him again. That evening, Jane tells Mr. Rochester about her life since leaving Thornfield. She talks about her new wealth and teases him by mentioning St. John's marriage proposal. Mr. Rochester becomes jealous, but Jane reassures him that her heart has always been his. The next day, they walk together in the garden. Mr. Rochester proposes to Jane again. This time, she happily agrees. Mr. Rochester then shares something strange. A few nights ago, he prayed to God and called out Jane's name 3 times. He thought he heard her reply. Jane is shocked, realizing it was the same night she heard his voice at Moor House. She does not tell him this, but feels amazed by their connection. As they return to the house, Mr. Rochester leans on Jane for support. She becomes his guide and partner as they begin their life together. Jane marries Mr. Rochester in a small and quiet ceremony. She writes to her cousins Diana and Mary to share the happy news. They reply with warm congratulations, but St. John does not respond. Shortly after the wedding, Jane visits Adele at her boarding school. She finds Adele unhappy with the strict environment. Remembering her own hard childhood, Jane moves Adele to a better school closer to home. For the first 2 years of their marriage, Jane helps Mr. Rochester as he adjusts to his blindness. After 2 years, he begins to regain sight in one eye. He is filled with joy when he sees their first child, a son who has inherited his dark, intelligent eyes. Meanwhile, St. John's follows his calling and becomes a missionary in India. In his final letter to Jane, he writes about his readiness to meet God and says his life's work is complete. Jane feels she may never hear from him again, but is comforted knowing he is at peace with his destiny. So that's it. The story of Jane Eyre ends. But do you know, there are some stories which give birth to other stories. And the story of Bertha Mason gave rise to this beautiful novel, White Sargasso Sea. If you haven't heard of it, do check out the podcast of White Sargasso Sea on our channel. Meanwhile, this is Monami Mukherjee taking your leave. Stay happy, stay subscribed. Good night.